We are the Childhood Collective, and we have helped thousands of overwhelmed parents find joy and confidence in raising their child with ADHD. I'm Katie, a speech language pathologist.
And I'm Lori.
And I'm Mallory, and we're both child psychologists. We combine the science of ADHD with the compassion of moms and bring you practical tools you can start using today.
So hit subscribe and let's help your family shine with ADHD.
When it comes to school, I think the emotion that we hear from parents the most is that they're feeling helpless. Their child is struggling, but they don't even know where to start when it comes to getting their child help at school.
Yes, and we get messages from parents saying their child's being sent home with behavior slips, or the teacher's emailing with concerns, or they're getting the dreaded call from school on a regular basis.
Yes, and a lot of parents tell us that the school is actually turning to them for help, but they don't know what to say or what to ask for. So we just hear a lot of parents who are feeling really helpless.
Yeah, and a lot of times these families, they get to the point of actually having a meeting with the school. The meeting feels intimidating. Parents are questioning whether they really know their child. They're struggling to speak up. And I won't say this is the case for everyone because there really are some amazing educators and school staff out there, but this is just a really common message that we're getting from parents.
Totally. And we know you listeners want to feel equipped to get your child the help that they need at school. And this really starts with knowing your rights. And even though it might not feel like it, as a parent of a child with ADHD, you actually have a lot of rights when it comes to the school.
It's true. So, in today's episode, we are going to talk about your child's rights as a student with ADHD or suspected ADHD, as well as some first steps that you can take when getting your child support at school. Let's start with 3 things you need to know when getting your child help at school.
So, one of the first things that we want to introduce you to is something called the Dear Colleague letter. And this is a really important letter because for many of you parents out there, you're maybe getting different communication from the school about whether your child should get a 504 plan, whether they should be evaluated. Your child might be struggling with all these behavioral issues and you don't know what's right, what's wrong, those types of things. And what we know from this letter, which was actually written by the U.S. Department of Education, and they have an office for civil rights. And this letter was written to schools, public and charter schools, to let them know what they were legally obligated to do to support kids with ADHD. And the reason why they wrote this letter was because over the span of 5 years, the Office of Civil Rights had over 2,000 complaints against schools specifically for kids with ADHD. Parents saying that their kids with ADHD were being discriminated against within the schools. And so when the Office of Civil Rights kind of looked at all of these complaints, they started seeing patterns to them of things that schools really weren't doing correctly to support kids with ADHD. And so they wrote this letter, the Dear Colleague letter, which we are going to link in the show notes. So we really recommend, again, there's a lot of jargon in there and it's kind of somewhat hard to understand. But it is really important as a parent of a child with ADHD to really know what schools should be doing. This letter really outlines that.
I think that the fact that they had to write this letter is kind of a reflection of schools are kind of confused about how do we best support these students with ADHD, which then, of course, if schools are trying to figure this out, parents are really confused then. They're getting mixed messages. It's challenging. So hopefully this letter kind of clarified for schools what could be done, and hopefully that trickles down to parents.
Yeah, so I think what's important for parents to know is actually there really is a problem in the schools, in many schools, that kids with ADHD really aren't being supported properly, which is why they had to write this letter. And this letter outlines lots of things that the schools should be doing that they were finding in those complaints that the schools weren't doing. So again, it's really important as a parent to know those things because your school might not. In fact, I think many of my colleagues don't even know that this letter exists. So I think it's really important to kind of reference that and understand it as a parent. If you're feeling pushback or you're feeling like your child isn't supported, you're not alone. And this has happened to many, many families, thousands of families, probably more that haven't spoken up, and that you really do need to know your rights and advocate for your child at school because it is an issue.
It is. And today we're going to be talking about a lot of things that have some jargon and that school psychology kind of terminology. And I know that can be super overwhelming for parents. And I know sometimes for myself, if I'm hearing something that I don't fully understand, I kind of tune out. And we want to encourage you not to do that. We're going to try to do today sort of broad strokes to help you understand your child's rights and some basic things that you can do. We also have an online course that explains all of this in so much more detail. And we released that course about a year ago, and we've gotten incredible feedback from families who are in this exact same position where they don't know what to do and they're overwhelmed about all the calls. But then we break things down in the course much more in depth. It's so hard to do that in a 25-minute podcast episode, but we really go in detail in the course. So that's something that we'll also link in the show notes if you're interested.
Yeah, and it's called Shining at School with ADHD.
Yes, and you don't have to have a law degree or be a school psychologist to understand it, because we really do want to help break it down. So think of today as kind of an introduction and some basic information that's going to really help you, but know that this isn't the end of your journey if you still have questions.
Absolutely. So I think the first thing to know is there's this Dear Colleague letter. It exists. If you feel like your child needs more support at school, you're not sure what to do, you're not alone. The second thing to know, and this is so important because we hear this from parents all the time, is that their child is getting good grades at school. And because of that, they have been told that their child cannot get help at school, doesn't need extra help. Their grades are fine. Their learning is progressing as expected. They have a good GPA. Parents are hearing this message all the time. We can't do anything because grades are fine. And because of that, their child can't get a 504 plan, can't get an IEP. And a quick pause here. Again, this is where we are trying not to get too jargony, but 504 plans and individualized education plans, also known as IEPs, if these are unfamiliar to you, we do have a blog that goes into a lot more detail. We'll be sure to link that in the show notes. But the quick explanation here is that 504 plans and IEPs are both a form of a formal plan with the school, public or charter, that guarantees your child support at school. So kind of going back to the grade issue here, though, is that sometimes schools will deny a student with a medical diagnosis of ADHD one of these plans, a 504 plan or an IEP, because the student is performing fine academically. But the really important thing here is that we need to be looking at the whole child. We're not just looking at academics. So in the Dear Colleague letter, they said this is the wrong way to look at decision making. We shouldn't only be looking at a child's academics. They went on to say that students who perform well academically can still be substantially limited in one or more other activity, which is one of the requirements for getting a 504 plan.
Yes. So for kids who have that medical diagnosis of ADHD, the main takeaway here is that it's not just their grades. We want to look at all different areas of their school day. We had someone on the podcast who called it from bus to bell, I think, or bell to bus. I'm totally messing that up. But the idea being like your child is at school all day. It's not just academics. We know that for kids with ADHD, they can have significant challenges in executive functioning. For example, they might be able to do their math homework relatively easily, but turning it in every day is a huge project. And their grades might not look bad because they can do well on quizzes and tests in the moment, but the day-to-day organizing their planner and knowing what they have to do and bringing home their spelling words can be really challenging. And so a 504 plan can support kids with their executive functioning. Additionally, we see a lot of kids with behavioral challenges at school where they're getting in fights, there's disciplinary issues, or they have social emotional needs that aren't being addressed. And so we just want to clarify that we don't just use grades or academics as the key and only way to differentiate whether a child needs additional services.
Yeah, and I think where it gets kind of fuzzy, for instance, when we're looking at an IEP, many team members at a school might say, well, we're looking for a negative impact on their educational functioning. And that is true, but they interpret educational functioning as academic functioning, and they are not the same thing.
I think another thing to keep in mind too is that the grades might be good, but your child might be working double, triple to get those grades versus
Yes.
another peer. Homework might be taking them 3 hours instead of just 20 minutes. The amount of executive functioning load for a child to, start a task and finish a task all the way through might be a lot more. So we also need to be considering, okay, the grades are good, but how hard are they having to work to show that knowledge? So I think that third thing to know, that really important thing, is that the Dear Colleague letter says that if a child has a medical diagnosis of ADHD, they at least need a 504 plan at school. We can assume because a child has a medical diagnosis of ADHD, they are somehow limited in one or more activities. There's a chance that the child may even be in need of specially designed instruction, even more support that then would come with an IEP.
Okay, so we just hit on the 3 things that you really need to know if you have a child with ADHD in the schools. But here are 3 things that we really recommend that you do. So the first kind of thing that you can do is to send an email to the teacher. We always recommend putting any requests or concerns or things like that in writing whenever we're dealing with school type issues, because it's good to be able to track that. And there are also kind of legal timelines tied to things that are put into writing. So we really recommend sending an email to your teacher and sharing the concerns that you're having. So if your child is having lots of behavioral referrals in the classroom, maybe they're missing recess, maybe they're forgetting to bring books home or things like that, send an email to your teacher and start sharing those concerns and talk with them about the challenges. Also, within that email, it's good to kind of share what you're struggling with at home related to school things. So if you're having lots of issues with homework, or again, they're not bringing home the books that they need, or even their homework assignments. And then also, if there are things that are going well at home, like maybe things are awesome at home, but they're really struggling at school, make sure to share that and communicate that with your teacher too, so that if you're having success using certain interventions or accommodations with your child at home, that the teacher knows what to do in the classroom to support them.
Absolutely. And I think that this is an important and a great way to kind of establish your desire to work with your child's teacher. You want to problem solve together. You're not just saying, oh, that's a school problem, not my problem. Like, you're communicating, you care about this. You want to work as a team to have things go better at home and school.
Absolutely. We get so many questions from parents like, my child's teacher emailed me and this is what she said. And I think there tends to be this defensiveness, and I do it too, where you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to say. But really keeping in mind, especially starting out, we really do want to try to start from a positive place and really assuming the best. Your child's teacher is trying to help. They're trying to understand more about what you do at home and what's been helpful. And so just really sharing the information in a really positive and relational way. I think we hear a lot of, especially in our field, right? Like, we support families through these really complicated second opinion evaluations. There's full blown legal battles happening sometimes. And so there's kind of this assumption that it's not going to go well. But for a lot of families in a lot of situations, just starting with that email and having that conversation can be a great first step that you can actually start to put some pieces in place. I've done it with my own kids, and there hasn't necessarily been a need to go much further than that right away.
I think another thing to keep in mind as well is that most teachers have zero formal training in ADHD. If they understand ADHD, it's generally some kind of professional development that they've sought out, reading that they've done on their own. Maybe they have a child with ADHD themselves, but most programs, most university programs don't talk more than maybe a paragraph about ADHD. So if a teacher is reaching out to you and asking you for help, it may be because they really truly don't understand ADHD and how that looks. And it's a great opportunity for you to kind of establish yourself as almost an expert on your child, certainly, but also you know more about ADHD than they do, perhaps. So it's an opportunity to kind of educate them on that too. And if they're seeking out that information, they're asking you for help, that's a great opportunity to do that.
Such a great point.
So I think the first thing you can do, like Lori said, share these concerns, share things that are working for you if there are things that are working for you. The second thing that you can do if you're concerned about your child at school is request a meeting, a formal meeting with your child's teacher, perhaps the school psychologist. Sometimes the vice principal or the principal like to be in those meetings if they're the ones that are kind of coordinating the 504 plans. But request a meeting to discuss your concerns. The Dear Colleague letter laid out how schools need to be considering evaluating a child if parents or teachers are observing signs of ADHD. So maybe the child is struggling to sustain attention in the classroom. They're very restless. They're moving around a lot. They're having a challenging time sitting still. They're having trouble staying organized. The ability to follow through on multiple tasks doesn't seem appropriate to their grade level. They're struggling with following multiple step projects. They're experiencing differences with their communication or social skills. The Dear Colleague letter says that schools need to be paying attention to these things and then conducting evaluations if those things are observed. And again, it's not just about your child's learning and academics. That's not the only requirement for getting an evaluation at school. Bad grades aren't the only requirement. If your child is showing differences in their executive functioning skills or their social abilities, that is reason enough to consider an evaluation for your child.
And I just want to jump in really quickly because I know I had a really good friend and I was always talking to her and I would say, she would tell me how her daughter was struggling at school. And I would say, well, have they done testing? Have they done an evaluation? And for like an embarrassingly long time, maybe a year, she would always say, yeah, they do testing. Of course they do testing. But it kept happening. She kept struggling. And one night we were sitting by the fire outside and I said, what kind of testing did they do? And she's like, spelling tests and math tests. Every week we get her grades. And I think it's really important to clarify that when we are talking about an evaluation, we're talking about a large separate evaluation that the school would do. They don't do this with every child. It's not part of progress monitoring or your child's everyday grades. Yep. They would actually, the school psychologist and potentially a speech language pathologist like myself, an occupational therapist, maybe a behavioral specialist, they do comprehensive testing and evaluation, which takes place over a couple weeks, and you would get a formal report of the findings of that evaluation. So for anyone who's listening is like, what is an evaluation again? That's what we're talking about, is if there's these concerns, whether it's academic, social, executive functioning, when you request an evaluation, that is a formal process that they have a certain number of days to complete and by law, and then they will come back to you with results. And again, it's complicated, but we do get more into this in Shining at School. But that's what we mean when we're referring to an evaluation.
Yep. And another thing to kind of keep in mind really quickly, because we had a student in our Shining at School course reach out because they didn't actually want to go through the evaluation process and they were just wanting to get some accommodations to start with. And the school was kind of saying, well, the medical diagnosis isn't enough. We have to do an evaluation. And fortunately, she kind of understood after taking the course, like, no, I can get the 504 plan and just kind of start there, and was able to do that successfully. So that's another thing to kind of keep in mind, is that if you've already gotten that outside medical diagnosis and you're not wanting to go through that whole process, that is an option too for you.
Absolutely. And I think kind of going off of that, if you don't have a medical diagnosis of ADHD yet, you simply suspect ADHD, you don't have to have a medical professional provide that diagnosis. And this is a big misunderstanding here, is sometimes schools will tell parents, oh, you need that medical diagnosis, which is not true. School psychologists have a high level of training in ADHD. They have the ability to determine if a child is exhibiting characteristics of ADHD, to determine if a child can qualify for these extra supports at school. So your child can get support at school even without the formal medical diagnosis. And in some states, even school psychologists can make a diagnosis of ADHD. Some states they can't. but you don't have to have that formal medical diagnosis from a pediatrician or a psychologist outside of the school to qualify for supports either.
Yeah, and I know some people listening will be like, well, doesn't the school do the ADHD diagnosis? And like Mallory said, a lot of them actually don't, but they can evaluate in those areas to say whether or not it's impacting them.
So, in other words, what you're saying is they could still get services
Yes.
for the areas that are impacted by their ADHD, but technically they wouldn't call it ADHD.
They might say that they're at risk or it's suspected. So I've gotten evaluations from school psychologists that may not give a formal diagnosis, but they would say, we're providing an individualized education plan because we suspect that they have ADHD and they're showing those signs.
Yeah. So just something to clarify that's so confusing for
I know
families.
this is really, really
Yeah.
confusing.
The same with reading, right? Like the school will say it's a reading disorder, but a lot of schools won't diagnose dyslexia because that's a
Exactly.
medical term.
Yep.
Yep. And I think another thing to think about too, let's say your child has a medical diagnosis of ADHD and you have them on medication and things are going pretty good at school. What the Dear Colleague letter says is that students with a medical diagnosis of ADHD that are being medicated should still be considered for supports at school. And if a child is going through the evaluation process, they should be evaluated when they're not on medicine. And when determining what supports your child needs at school and whether they need accommodations, you should consider how the student is unmedicated when making those decisions, because there's a lot of reasons that your child might show up to school unmedicated one day. They might forget to take their medication that morning. You may be in the process of switching medications because your child was experiencing side effects. You may be impacted by the medication shortage. There's a lot of reasons that your child could show up to school unmedicated. And if we're saying a child doesn't need extra supports at school because when they're medicated, they're fine, what happens on those days where they might show up unmedicated or those long periods of time? So what the Dear Colleague letter says is we should make support plans and we should determine what a child needs, considering a child who's when they're unmedicated.
Yeah, and another issue that I see come up all the time is schools will say, well, they're on medication, they're doing really well at school. But the piece that they're not seeing that does impact them is that the meds are wearing off right after school. And then homework time, they're really unmedicated and parents are spending 3-4 hours on homework. And so those accommodations aren't just for during the school day. You can get accommodations for homework time so that you're not spending 3 hours at night. You're shortening homework assignments and things like that. So that's another reason why it's important.
Absolutely. So when we're making these decisions, we should really be thinking about your child when they're unmedicated.
Definitely. So we've been talking a little bit about accommodations, and we talked about how kids may need an evaluation at school. But something that a lot of parents don't know, which is point number 3, is that you can ask for accommodations to be started even as the school is evaluating your child. So something that we often hear from parents is that they went to the school, they requested an evaluation, and the school agreed to evaluate, and they said, "We're just going to wait until the end of that evaluation." Or another thing schools like to do is called response to intervention, where they do some kind of low level interventions. RTI is another name for it. But we want to make sure that if our kids need accommodations, they can start those right away. If you're not sure what accommodations you would ask for or how that might be helpful, we do have a free guide and we will link that in the show notes. But that is going to give you very specific situations. So my child has difficulty with aspects of writing. And then we give you a list of suggested accommodations for various things that we often see for kids in the classroom. And these are things that the teacher can do in the classroom and that you can do at home often as well. And so that's just really important for you to know that getting an evaluation should not delay your ability to start getting accommodations.
And kind of the reverse side of that, which I think you touched on here with RTI, Katie, is that doing accommodations shouldn't delay the evaluation. And that's
Absolutely.
what the Dear Colleague letter laid out, is that implementing accommodations, we should be doing the accommodations simultaneously while we're evaluating. We shouldn't use that as a reason to delay the evaluation. So the Dear Colleague letter says, let's do both of these things simultaneously so that nothing is unnecessarily put off or delayed, that we're getting these kids the support they need as soon as possible.
And if you're feeling kind of lost, overwhelmed, if you've gotten responses from the school saying they aren't going to support them, again, we walk you through those processes in our online course, Shining at School. So check that out in the show notes. And we talk about, again, if you're not getting the response that you want from the school, what the avenues are for addressing that legally for you. So to wrap up, again, I know this was a little bit of a complicated podcast episode, so thanks for hanging in there. But if you have a child with ADHD or suspected ADHD, you do have rights that protect your child in the public and charter school setting, and knowing those rights is essential to advocating for them.
Thanks for listening to Shining with ADHD by your hosts, Lori, Katie, and Mallory of the Childhood Collective.
If you enjoyed this episode, please like this video and hit subscribe so you can be the first to know when a new episode airs.
If you are looking for links and resources mentioned in this episode, you can always find those in the show notes. See you next time.